Romanticism. The term Romanticism appeared in the 18th century, and it meant romance-like. It resembled the medieval romances, praised highly in stories still being told today. Romanticism means self-expression and revolt against precise rules, still dating from the age of classicism. It's seen as a partial reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The time and setting. The age of Romanticism bloomed between 1795 and 1848. The French Revolution was the cause for many changes in people's thinking in the 18th century. The first phase of the French Revolution was marked by the Declaration of the Human and Civil Rights and the Bastille storming. Political prisoners were freed, and the French got a hugely enthusiastic reaction from the English. Romantics were not thinkers of the past. They thought about the future and how it must not be predestined. Romantics came up with the term history. The writing of history became something more than just a tagging of accomplishments and facts, but also a timeline and reason for why life in later stage was like that. Culture-wise, the most important way of company was having friends who were loyal to you and who you were likewise loyal to. What also changed in the age of Romanticism was the way a couple got together. Before, it would be because both fathers would think it to be a good investment to marry their child to a certain family. But later on, it became evident that some people just didn't like each other enough to marry, even if they could grow on each other. This is the reason for love life to change. People started choosing their partners instead of their partners being chosen for them. Language-wise, the English language hasn't changed much since the last 225 years. One of the pieces of art from that time you can compare to a book called Pride and Prejudice. It easily shows the differences with our present-day English, most of these differences being new words and ways of saying things. Also, at that time, people spoke in a better educated way. At least that's what the book projects.
Influential features of the language effect on the language itself. So, the age of Romanticism brought many characteristics. This means that there were also new influences in poetry, writing, English language at that time. English literature was overwhelmed by the Romantic movement. Different poets had great impact on literature. One of them is William Wordsworth. An example of the following poem he wrote. She had a rustic, woodland air, and she was widely glad. Her eyes were fair, and very fair. Her beauty made me glad. The source is from Louis R. 7. He wrote about a woman that caught his eye, and this was very common to do. Many of these poems are found in the book Lyrical Ballads, which is often referred as the start of the movement itself. Because most of these poets received great interest, they influenced people throughout Europe. Romanticism in English literature had a little connection with nationalism, and outsiders often think that Romantics felt sympathy for the ideals of the French Revolution, which was mostly true. As soon as the dictatorship of Napoleon got there, it was a shock to the movement. One of the most significant writers during the peak of the Romantic period was Jane Austen, who had a worldview that was totally different compared to other Romantics. She had a strong belief in social rules, although many disagreed with her. This is a quote from Wikipedia. Because Austen's novel failed to conform to Romantic and Victorian expectations that powerful emotions could be authenticated by an irreligious display of sound and color in the writing. 19th century critics and audiences generally preferred the work of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. She also had many highlights in her work that were referred to the dependence of woman on a social and economic basis. English literature had a great impact on the English language. Literature is one of the main reasons we now name it the Age of Romanticism. Poetry was something very popular at that time, and many people were interested in it. So, the language used in poetry could be overtaken by the readers. The Romantic period was a major social change in England because many people moved to industrial cities. This led to a revolution that led to thinking of many Romantic poets. The literature in this period was more influenced by the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement are the people who agree with the senses of Romanticism, which contains sharing romantic ideas, movements of literature and art, and an exciting and mysterious quality. There are two main generations in Romantic poetry. One is the period with Wordsworth and Coleridge, and later on with Byron Shelley and Keats. The Romantic period basically started with the lyrical ballads, which was in 1798. The lyrical ballads were planned by Wordsworth and his friend Coleridge on a walking trip. The main reason for this is that they wanted to experiment with a new kind of poetry. The most important subjects were nature and simple life. A typical poem is We Are Seven, like I've told before. Although this was a great example of how the literature started, there were many critics. People considered the poem to be silly and mother's love for a child. These poems could also express that the poems talk about simple life, but in a different way. Coleridge's most famous poem is The Name of the Ancient Mariner. And this poem is about a sailor in the time of Queen Elizabeth and considered weird by some critics. Coleridge's poetry is known to be strange and unfinished. He thought ideas were very important in poetry. He stated, "A poet can create new truth and reality." He wrote critical work and helped introducing German idealism to English-speaking poetry and culture. He suffered from anxiety and depression. Some suggest he was bipolar. He had a very poor health, which eventually caused him to die. Wordsworth's poetry is expressed his philosophy, which is this combination between man and nature. His imagination had a wide range of new expressions. His main thought was all created things are animate, which spirit and participate in the mystic life of nature. He was a poet who was interested more in nature spirit than others, which made him special at the time. He claims that he is inspired and made into a better person. Wordsworth came from a big family and was the second child from the five. His sister was a poet, which got himself involved in poetry as well. He didn't got much involvement from his father, but he did encourage him to continue his interest in poetry by letting him read books from his library. He was taught the Bible, so he was religious, and later on he visited revolutionary France and fell in love with a French woman named Annette Fallon. Later on, a new future became famous. This was romance. A famous poet in that time was Lord Byron. He was a very rich guy with a colorful personality and an interesting life. Because he was rich, he was high in the social class. Unfortunately, he had an unhappy marriage and decided to leave the country and seek for adventure. He traveled through Belgium, Germany, and other countries. He wrote poems based on his adventures. An example is Childe Harold, which is from 1816. Some poems were already discussed in the influences features of the language and the author context, but we haven't really discussed many yet. A good example of a typical poem of the ancient Romanticism was La Belle Dame sans Merci, the beautiful woman without mercy. The poetry of Keats is considered to be sentimental, and this poem is an example of his work. It shows the feelings and the mood towards the plot. It's a typical love story, but with more mystery and sadness.